Much appreciated. Good to think we didn't set the bar high right from the start. So for anyone that was here last year I gave a very heartwarming story, if you will, from the start. This year I'm going to keep it much more casual, especially being that I think it's happy hour for a lot of us. All right, some of us, not going to mention names, might have started early. That said, Jeff Carroll did suggest that I have a tip jar. All right, I'm not going to subject myself to that, so if you could just pass that around, that would be great. But in all honesty, I'm here today to talk about sort of a practical approach, but also a general approach to training the tactical athlete. And so what we're going to talk about is the men, the mission, and then finally one entire slide about me. Okay, so essentially what I want to convey is how we should prioritize our approach to training athletes, because I think we come to events like this and we get caught up, and I've heard this even mentioned a couple times already, in training approaches, right? The X's and the O's and the stuff we love and the stuff we obsess about, and that's important for us to do so. But at the end of the day, when we go back to our units, we also have to deal with the reality of all of these things. So most of you probably know the title from this presentation. It comes loosely from Pete Blaber's book, The Mission, the Men, and Me. So of course, I've rearranged this in a way that should make more sense for our population, because in all honesty, while the men might prioritize the mission, I don't think that that's necessarily where our priorities should lie, and I'll discuss that in more detail later. And then you can see, all right, I've all but erased me from the picture. So in that book, all right, there are several key concepts, key take-home concepts, a few of which I'll mention throughout this, but really I just use the title as a slight play on words. This is not a representation of his book by any means. But trust the guys on the ground. And in this case, I'm here as the guy on the ground. I've been fortunate enough to be on both sides, all right, the guy in the squat rack, all right, or at the time more like the guy doing crunches and 2-mile runs, all right? But now I'm the guy fortunate enough to coach these athletes. And so I think it's important that that guy on the ground that's living that reality conveys some of that in a way that some people who live in a more idealistic world can understand, so that when they're pushing things, possibly from the top down or troubleshooting or nitpicking, they have a little bit more of an appreciation for the barriers that we sort of face on a daily basis. That said, I'm not by any means a car guy, and I am not into metaphors. So I'm going to tell a metaphorical car story. So last year we arrived at TSAC, myself, and I'm not going to mention anyone by name, but we could call him Golden Locks, okay? Because he does have beautiful, luscious golden locks, or did so last year. And we arrive at the rental car, and we go to pick out a rental car. And of course, we've got our ideals. It was in San Diego, right? And we knew we were going to be doing some trips up the coast of exactly what we should pick out as our rental vehicle. So we walk the floor, and we're looking at maybe a slight upgrade. And we see, this 2-seater Mercedes convertible. Beautiful, right? Imagine driving up the beach in that. So we asked what it would be to upgrade. Turns out, surprisingly, we can actually afford it. All right? Unfortunately, both of us overpacked. All right? We have suitcases the size of ourselves, and there's no trunk in this thing. At least not if you want to have the top down, which of course we did. So we do our best to try to cram into this thing with our suitcases, and finally realize we can't actually safely maneuver this vehicle. It's just not what's right for us, right? And so instead, we end up compromising, all right? And we get a car with more room, more seats, and a trunk. We end up in a Dodge Challenger, right? Still not bad. Still a decent amount of power. But at the end of the day, we had to make a compromise based on practicality, okay? And that said, that's a little bit about what I'm going to talk to you about today. Again, continuing to not use car metaphors. So when we look at our athletes, sometimes we find ourselves in the weight room in the morning in a 50 to 1 athlete to coach ratio, right? And so most of us know, or most of us seek and continue to develop the ideal. How do we test these guys? How do we train these guys? How do we deliver as much specificity as possible to these soldiers? In doing so, we have to account for the vast array of variety that exists within the group. So we tend to think, everyone's coming through selection, they're just stamping out these cookie cutter individuals. They show up at our doorstep. All of them have, amazing aerobic capacity. They're probably pretty weak, no power output, poor movers, great linear only, okay? But what really is arriving at our doorstep, right, are guys with tremendous grit and some baseline of physical performance. And what exactly that baseline is certainly fluctuates from guy to guy based on his own personal preferences, his own natural physicality and background. So one important thing that we need to do is assess all of these athletes, right, to create some sort of objectivity amongst them. Rob Hartman discussed this morning in immense detail ways to assess both aerobic and anaerobic properties, okay? Within each of those, I believe he named at least 3 different subsets of each. So of course, if you look at something like this is sort of a gross generalization of the spectrum of physicality that guys will have or gals will have. So certainly you can look and say, well, anaerobic, what about, do you mean anaerobic endurance? Do you mean anaerobic capacity? Do you mean anaerobic power? What do you mean when you say anaerobic? Again, just thinking in generalities. What's appropriate and specific to your population is appropriate and specific to your population. And again, trusting the guy on the ground, I feel that is something that should be developed within your own organization. But I do think, if nothing else, you need to have some sort of way to almost keep yourself in check to make sure that you are assessing people and labeling them in a way that facilitates better targeted training. So moving beyond that, we certainly have a whole lot of different types of operators, correct? We have a guy who, I think he had the fastest VVO2 max on our incremental treadmill test a couple of years ago, maybe second fastest, but then that same individual was unable to perform a single pull-up, right? So if you ask that question of how far, this guy could go forever. And again, he's got some baseline of physical performance. He made it through selection. He was fairly new to the group at the time. And I'm sure that he relied heavily on his aerobic capabilities to get where he is. That said, what's his graph going to look like? If we take his performance and we graph it, again, objectively, he's probably going to be in the red. So I should probably better explain this, but briefly, right, within the red, that's kind of substandard, we'll call that. The black, right, getting into the black, sort of like the accounting world, that's where you want to be. That's on par with group average. Now, these aren't standards necessarily set by us. Let's just say this is taking a look at the group in general and saying that somewhere within the group, the average is what depicts sufficient level of physicality to operate, all right? Because I think a lot of times, slight tangent, but I think a lot of times we get nitpicky, like, oh, is it 405 on the deadlift that's really enough, or is it 395, or maybe it's 375? It's not the guy that's going between 375 and 405 I'm worried about. It's the guy that can't pick up 135, right? And those do exist. Even though we like to think that everybody's above that, the truth is we all have somebody in that case, and that does exist. There is that guy that can't do that single pull-up. So again, starting to paint a picture, though, for this individual, which gives us an idea where we need to bias a little more of our time and effort. All right, much in the same way, all right, we have a sergeant major that absolutely loves strongman. I mean, he literally walks around going, strongman, like all the time. So, all right, and he's trying to figure out how can we get yokes into our facility, right? How can we get more strongman stuff? He's fabricated heavier sleds that look just like the lighter sleds that last I checked you could put weight on, okay? But just to say that we have some strongman, some heavier sleds. So with that regard, right, we certainly have some people, although I would say fewer within our community, that are going to have a bias toward strength and potentially power, okay? Assuming with all of these at this point that we're just going to call movement average, and we'll touch on that a little bit later. Now, of course, beyond that, what do we have? We have that guy, right, saunters in the morning, looks like he's in a lot of pain, looks like he thinks he's 1,000 years old, and he'll even say, like, man, coach, wait till you turn 35. And you're like, I'm 36, right? And he's like, oh, yeah, but it's, it's different. It's different. He thinks he's got all these miles on him, and he almost holds himself back, and he ends up in this substandard place. So where he ends up, right, is somewhere in that inside, living somewhere in that red. And with someone like that, you almost don't even know where to begin with bringing them up to a sufficient level of physicality. Quick note, I'm from the Pacific Northwest, in case you never do. So somewhere within all of this, right, it lies what I consider the answer, and the answer is not necessarily as sexy as we want it to be. All right, so somewhere within all of this lies that versatile operator. Right? He's strong enough, however you want to define that. I would say specific to what he does. Right? He's fast enough. He's got decent aerobic and anaerobic properties. He's well-rounded. Right? He can not only handle the mountains, he can handle the journey to the mountains. And if he's got to pull something out of those mountains like one of his buddies, he can do that too. Right? He exists just beyond what we would call the average. So what I'm suggesting as a way to approach this is sort of this, what I would call an athlete-centric continuum. Starting out, I kind of got obsessed with alliteration on this one. Competence, right? Begin at the beginning. Get a guy to a baseline of movement capabilities and understanding. From there, we can segue into confidence, and I'll be going over these in detail momentarily. With confidence, we're talking about bringing the bottom up. So the first thing we did, we actually established a floor for this guy to stand on. And now what we want to do is bring that floor up. And finally, competitiveness. With competitiveness, I'm going to say keep the goal the goal. That might not sound that competitive to you, but I'll explain that again when we get to that point. So again, competence. This is where we're starting. We want to begin at the beginning, right? Beginning is typically a pretty good place to start. So where is that beginning for any of these people? Well, one thing that you'll notice I didn't talk about before was somebody who might be lacking movement-wise. And I think that anybody that was in Jeff's presentation yesterday and saw what I assume to not be coaches, but more than likely some sort of tactical athletes in there, attempting to skip laterally, right? Very quickly understood that they're probably lacking in some movement qualities. Now, of course, that's almost even getting into performance-based movement qualities. What I'm talking about is before we even get into this assessment that I had with these 5 different areas of performance, maybe we should start by just assessing their ability to even train. Now, a quick note with any of this, if I sound like I'm on a soapbox, I'm actually talking to myself because this is something that we currently do not do where I work. And so a lot of this actually came out of introspection, all right, and myself and colleagues discussing how are ways that we can make our program more efficient down the line. You'll notice I have qualitative and I have it in capital letters, and this is something that somebody might debate me on and start sending me FMS scores, okay? But I think that it goes beyond, we all want a quantitative analysis of movement, and he got a 16 on the FMS, and that's good enough, and let's call it a day. Let's throw him into the fold, all right? But the truth is it goes beyond that, right? There is value to the coaching eye. There is value to a PT's analysis of somebody. There is value even to how that athlete perceives themselves, and those are things that are qualitative in nature, but still need to be taken into account. One thing that I think is very important that I'm almost embarrassed to say that I don't currently do is this collection of injury history. I'll have somebody come in and do a performance assessment, all right, not movement assessment, with prior injury, which of course we know is a high indicator of potential for future injury. And not only that, we don't know what his rehabilitation might have looked like or if it was even completed, because it probably happened in a course. He probably took off, went on 2 months of leave, showed up to group maybe a little bit out of shape, hoping that that time healed all wounds, and nothing's really any better than when he left the assessment course. And of course, evaluate movement, something we've already talked enough about. With regard to eliminating injury, something none of us like to hear as coaches, but the coach is not always the answer. The coach is not always the answer. I think sometimes as coaches, we know just enough about each discipline, right, to be a little bit dangerous and to want to step outside of our own. And I think sometimes you need to step back and refer out. Make that phone call, okay? It's easy where we are. We have physical therapists right down the hall. We literally can walk somebody in there. Not only that, those physical therapists understand they don't exist to put people on profile and pull people out of the fight, all right? They exist to keep guys able to train at whatever level they can train at. We even have an athletic trainer that can bridge that gap now between the two, all right, which is even better. So it's a fairly seamless, I would say, return to training for most guys. And again, beyond that, those physical therapists have excellent relationships with other professionals. You'll notice up there I even have psychiatrists. All right, I think a lot of us know that some of guys' issues stem from something much bigger than their body, okay, and that's their brain, which is also their most valuable asset. Quick note on this, again, as coaches, we tend to love to dabble in other fields. And that's what we need to do, because then we can better communicate with all these other professionals. But something to remember at the end of the day, right? Nick Honzik is a phenomenal coach, but he also has a shirt that says Meathead Whisperer that he walks around and coaches in. And so maybe he's not the guy, right, to tell somebody that pop they felt in their back is just their soul leaving the body and they're fine, okay? So just keep that in mind. All right, I won't go deep into increasing movement capability, all right? But essentially my idea with this is that you can't coach people into positions that they are not able to achieve. That said, you will see on the bottom internal, external feedback. Sometimes you can. Sometimes it's just a matter of them being a cue away from successfully getting the bottom of that squat. But sometimes there might literally be some sort of limitation, right? Some sort of switch that needs to be turned off, something else that needs to be turned on. Whatever that roadblock is between what you want them to do and what they're actually able to do is something that needs to be addressed. Finally, more in the coaching realm than probably any of those that I've discussed so far with, again, regard to this competence phase of the continuum, is develop a training skill set. Plyometrics, powerlifting, running a multi-directional, weightlifting. I have those in quotes so that people won't get upset with me, because I'm also referring to variations of any of those, okay? Whatever it means to you to be doing powerlifting. What we're really saying is some explosive work, some strength work, some at body weight, some with implements, right? Running a multi-directional, all these different tools that we can give guys. One thing to remember with all of these, all right? Jeff talked about this last year. Guys love how much, how fast, right? Instead, we want to focus initially on how well. We used to push guys a little bit harder weight-wise. Now in our introductory programs, we will even set maximums as opposed to setting minimums. Because at that point, it's rarely strength that's holding them back in any of these. It's typically, even for a weaker guy, they can develop strength through simpler means, and it's typically more of an understanding of athleticism or an understanding of that movement specifically. Finally, it's not reality unless it's shared. This is another concept from the book, right? The mission, the men, and then me, and me. What do I mean by this? We are always analyzing, always assessing, always judging our guys. What we're not always doing a great job of is educating them on what they're doing, why they're doing it, why there is value in it. And that's important twofold because one, they need to know that, but two, it forces you to justify what you're doing a little bit. We've recently made a few changes as a result of that, of us trying to explain to ourselves why exactly we're doing what we're doing, and we kind of realize maybe some of these things don't have a reason, or those reasons aren't good enough for us to keep them around. And that evaluation process, right, that look into your own program, your own self, that's something that needs to happen consistently. So next up, we're going to talk then about confidence, right? Confidence. Bring the bottom up. A lot of times we concern ourselves, hey, what are your guys, what's his deadlift? Hey, how fast did he do that run, right? If you come to me and you're like, hey, I've got X amount of guys with 600-pound deadlifts, that's awesome. You should have that. I applaud you for that. And then my next question is going to be, how fast was their second shuttle in a 300-meter? Right? Because if you have so much of one thing and you're sacrificing so much of another, is that really appropriate? Right? If everybody on the highway is going the minimum, how are you ever going to get to the maximum? You're not. Okay? So that segues into a great story that we just learned recently. There's a sergeant major where we work who, when he was a teen guy, maybe when he's a team sergeant, but he would just walk up to somebody and silently hand them a broken link to a chain. Powerful, powerful symbol. Now, some of us might talk about negative reinforcement, but I think it does. It sets a bar. It lets a guy know, right, quietly, without broadcasting it, without airing dirty laundry, that he needs to bring his bottom up. He needs to bring his bottom up. So this is when I think it becomes more appropriate to look at somebody's ability to perform, right? We think of it this way. You've got this guy who comes in, and you're like, man, I don't know anything about him. I wonder if he can perform, right? No, he can't. He sucks, right? And now you got to put this back together, and you got to figure out some way to save him. And that's on you. That's on me. That's on the coach. That's on the person that broke him. That's on the person that didn't get his injury history, that didn't know that he was coming in with some major flaws that set him up for failure. But let's say we know just enough about a guy, right? Not ideal. But guess what? Totally fixable. We didn't totally lose him. He had enough of an understanding of movement that he could at least perform safely. He could be assessed. He could live another day to become even better, right? And eventually we can reinforce it. I want to throw, but I'm not going to. But eventually we reinforce it, and we can turn him into this. So again, that's when it's appropriate to start not only assessing his performance, but then addressing his performance. So what do we obviously want to do? We want to attack that weak link. All right, where I work, we have always done one program for everybody. That said, we have also always made modifications based on intensity. So whether, like Rob talked about this morning, right, modifications based on his conditioning abilities, modifications based on his strength abilities. Yes, we will change exercises based on injuries and things like that, but generally speaking, everybody's doing 5 sets of 3. Everybody's doing them at X percentage. But I think we know the truth that if a guy's, if he's at a 600 deadlift, to stay with the same example, right, 5 sets of 3 at X percentage is not going to treat him the same way that it might treat a guy who's walking in with a 200-pound deadlift or a 250 to make it more realistic. And so one might need less sets. One might need more sets. One might need different percentages. One might not really hardly need to deadlift at all and might need to double up his conditioning time. That said, leverage their strengths. Leverage their strengths. Now it's tough because again, we're looking at these 50-to-1 ratios and we're trying to figure out how can we gain specificity. And honestly, we're still figuring that out. I'm personally still figuring that out. But don't take away what that guy's good at and what that guy loves necessarily. Maybe find a way to leverage it, right? If he's a strong individual, maybe he'll enjoy doing some sled work for some of his conditioning stuff. Are you still going to get what you want out of it? Absolutely. Reinforce. I went back and forth on the word reinforce. All right. Also looking at using the word address. But basically, this is the fun stuff. This is what we do, right? Strength and conditioning. And so not only do you want to bring his bottom up, but then you want to continue to reinforce that. So again, when you have that guy who's got great aerobic capacity, you don't necessarily have him never run. You just have him run enough that he can continue to reinforce that and keep an appreciable level. And then same thing strength-wise. You don't take strength away from him. You just give him just enough. These are only 4 different variables of things that we can manipulate in order to move that needle. So when you're talking about reinforcing, you're not necessarily talking about continuing to push to another level, but you want to at least help them stay where they're at. And where you want to help them be is where they have this predictable level of performance, right? If you go up to any strength coach and you say, on any given day, what can you squat? They'll have an answer for you, right? Most even know on any given day what their coworkers can squat, what their coworkers can bench. Somebody asked me, in fact, Paul asked me this morning, hey, 1.5 miles, how fast right now, right? And I have enough of a history and enough experience that it was a sad answer, but I could give what's probably an accurate answer, right? It was like 7.5 minutes. No, it was not 7.5 minutes. So gain a predictable level of performance, because honestly, that's something that a lot of these guys don't have yet. They don't have an idea as to what they can come in and do. So, unless you gave them a specific number, even if you said to someone, hey, warm up somewhere around 60%, right? And then automatically everyone puts 135 on the bar and you start adding that up and you're like, I don't know if this many guys bench this much. That is not probably 60%. But that's right where they're going to go to, because they don't have that understanding. They don't have that training history. And so that's what you want. You want to get them to exhaust the honeymoon phase, right? We have our introductory program, which basically has 2 types of guys. Has the type of guy that's been in it for 2 years, right? It's a 6-week program. He's been in it for 2 years, and he's going to tell you how he's been in intros for 2 years. No, you haven't been in intros for 2 years. He just hasn't been coming in. And then you have the guy that goes 6 weeks straight through, and what happens? We look like rock stars. Because this guy came in, a lot of this stuff's probably foreign to him. And so he's in that honeymoon phase, right? All his weights are flying through the roof. These neuromuscular adaptations are incredible. He's probably already got an amazing level of conditioning that might just be underneath some rust and dust, and maybe that gets chiseled off, and suddenly he's revisiting his glory days, and he's running faster than he ever has because he discovered intervals. We want to get through that honeymoon phase, or find some way to continue to advance it. In case my wife sees this, I won't make any jokes. All right. And achieve maintainability. So what do I mean by that? You want to get to a level where you actually have something to fall back on that you can always fall back on. So in other words, Rob knows that if he squats once a week, right, he can always hit X number on that squat. He's just got to touch it just often enough to keep him at a reasonable percentage of his maximum, right? Achieve maintainability. So I think the final quote or concept that I'll use from the book is, when in doubt, develop the situation. So in other words, man, is this guy strong enough? Well, if you're not sure, continue to get him stronger. Right? Is this guy fast enough? Continue to get him faster. Right? Is that squat deep enough? Keep getting that squat deeper. In other words, never necessarily settle unless you're 110% certain that he is at a level that he needs to be at in order to best perform his job. So the final part we'll discuss is competitiveness. So again, with competitiveness, that subtitle I gave, Keep the goal the goal. Doesn't sound very competitive. Keep the goal, right? Why not push the limits? Why not win at all costs? Because the truth is, winning at all costs is what they're already doing in some other realm of their tactical training. And they do not need to win in the weight room. What we do is important, don't get me wrong. Again, I've been on both sides of the fences. The reason I'm on this side, the reason I'm on this side now is because I know there's a lot of value in bringing a smarter way to train to our tactical athletes. It's something I discussed last year with regard to culture. That said, some of us still have this obsession of making the weight room the battlefield, right? And we need to just take a step back from that. We kind of need to understand where our job begins and where our job ends and where it's time to hand that off. So for us, we need to keep the goal the goal. And what's the goal? Having a mission-capable man who's healthy, who's in the fight. So with regard to enhancing mission capability, what everyone does is their first question, and I'll probably still get it when I leave here, oh, you work with special forces. What do you do for the dive teams? What do you do for the mountain guys? What should I do for my guy? I'm training a high school swimmer right now. What should I do for her? That's like a dive team, right? But you'll notice we're 30-something slides deep into this presentation, and I'm just now talking about incorporating specificity. Now, that's specificity with regard to mission capability because I've already discussed specificity with regard to who? The operator, right? The men. The mission. We're just now getting to the mission. We don't really have any business chasing specificity when a guy doesn't have a respectably general level of physicality. And so again, begin at the beginning. Bring that bottom up. Get him to a place where now you can start to chase things a little bit. Now you can go down that road a little bit. Consider and or integrate tactical training. Now what I don't mean, right, is what Jeff Carroll would refer to as functional overload. Did I get that right? Sweet. All right, what I don't mean is guys with the lights off in the gym and night vision and, right, climbing ropes, okay? What I do mean is that their training is probably starting to get fairly specific, and you need to consider those competing demands, okay? Beyond that, you can certainly replicate some of those demands from a strength and conditioning perspective, right? But it doesn't mean that you need to recreate the battlefield necessarily in the gym. All right? And to upset some people, potentially, and I apologize in advance, but I just want to be honest in this presentation, one thing that quickly comes to mind, right, is an ORA, an Operator Readiness Assessment, okay? It's something that is recently coming down the pipe, and I'm not going to get far into this tangent, but the idea with the Operator Readiness Assessment is it's pass-fail, okay? And I'm not an expert on it by any means, but it's pass-fail, and essentially if a guy can do certain mission-specific tasks, then he's a pass, and it means he's physically ready to deploy. So two main issues I have with that. One, I'm a strength and conditioning coach. Okay, as soon as a guy puts on kit, I can observe, I can understand, I can appreciate what he does, and I can use that to make better decisions, but I'm no longer the guy to assess his performance. I'm not going to assess his kneeling shooting stance. I'm certainly not going to put him at risk by having him jump off high boxes with heavy loads on when I've seen that he can't even necessarily do a depth drop from a 12-inch box, right, and land it safely. And so just something to consider when we try to make the weight room the battlefield, sometimes we increase the risk. Sometimes we're assessing something that we could already answer without those risks. Now, I promised the second part. The second part, or the second issue I take with that, is that I can't make any training decisions based on that assessment. So in other words, if a guy can't climb a rope, or a guy can't jump a wall, or a guy can't land safely, or a guy can't drag something, Is it because he's not strong enough? I don't know. I didn't assess his strength. Is it because he doesn't have the endurance? I don't know. I didn't assess his endurance. And so now, following his quote-unquote failure of a test, right, that I didn't necessarily have any business implementing, I still have to give him another one. I'm going to start with the movement. I'm going to figure out if he's even somebody who should be doing any of this testing. And assuming he is, then I'm going to give him a performance-based test, because I can actually use the pieces of that test to build a program for this guy. Again, sorry if I upset you, but hopefully you understand where I'm coming from with it, and I will be happy to talk with anybody afterwards. And I'd love to hear your justification. I'd love to give you more about mine. Maintain quality under fatigue. I went a little back and forth with this because it almost could run contrary to a lot of what I've given you so far. All right. In light of Laura Landau's speech the other day with regard to the details, even when we start pushing the limits of capacity, guys and gals, we can never overlook the importance of the details. So in other words, is a barbell complex appropriate? That's up to you as a coach to decide. I am far from an absolutist. I never like a blanket, this isn't right, this is wrong type of approach. But I will say that quality must always be taken into consideration, and we are sort of the police or the keepers of quality. And so if we are going to use a barbell complex, we need to make sure it's done in a way where guys are getting the training effect we want them to get, right? And that they do so safely. All right, that said, that's just an example. Hopefully I came across correctly. Oh, let me back up. And then provide sufficient recovery, okay? It's one thing to push the envelope. It's another thing to push the envelope, push the envelope, push the envelope, and then not instill enough recovery that allows adaptation. And so you shouldn't be testing them. You should be training them. It is an investment. So you need to give them the opportunity to make gains based on that. Look, these guys are tested all the time. They're tested too often. They're tested throughout the entire selection process. They go to schools where they're tested all the time. They train for the test constantly. It's what they do. We've got a team right now. It's a dive team. They got a new team sergeant in from somewhere else. They decided to no longer train with our group, and instead they did a UBRR, which if you don't know what that is, upper body round robin, just a whole bunch of wild upper body endurance stuff. All right. And then they decided that they were going to train to improve the UBRR. I mean, they've got a plan, I'll give them that. But again, it's testing based. Will improving their performance on the UBRR make them better operators? I think 99 out of 100 strength coaches who work with tactical athletes and who know what the UBRR is will say no. Provide sufficient recovery. Expand maximums, right? This is the fun stuff. This is where you can start to chase dreams, okay? Increase the buffer between the mins and the maxes. So in other words, make sure that guy maintains that base level of performance, right? But now let's say, you know, he's been sufficiently well-rounded for some time, and he's got a little downtime. Maybe he's in an S shot. Maybe he's on a B team for a while. Maybe he just finally has some room to breathe and train consistently. Well, now he can start to push or favor one of those qualities over another, right? So long as we're maintaining the minimums. This is also where non-operational goals can almost maybe possibly begin to be a conversation, okay? A strong stance in our office has always been, we don't train hobbyists. We are not here to improve your 5K. We are not here to help you win an Ironman. Keep the goal the goal. That said, if somebody falls outside of the spectrum on all of these qualities, and they happen to have a moment where it's appropriate for them to take some time and train for something else, and we can guide that in some way, that might not necessarily be a bad thing, because the other option is you don't help him at all, you lose him, he trains in a way that doesn't help maintain his minimums, and now you really have done a disservice for the sake of your own ego. Now again, this is very far down that continuum or down that spectrum. And so for a guy to actually get to this level is going to be extremely rare, but just something to consider when you get to that time and you're making that decision of, do I help him, do I not? One place I would say that this is probably better related in this group is somebody training for another selection course. Because again, we train guys to do what they do within our unit, but if they want to go somewhere else, well, the first thing I'm going to say is you need to come to me with a baseline of fitness. And the way you achieve that baseline of fitness is training the way everyone else is training. It's not getting something special for a selection process because you don't even have a good enough starting off point. And so come do our introductory programs. Come train with us regularly. Get yourself to this well-rounded position, and then we can start to talk about non-operational goals or individual goals. We can talk about how do we get you ready for that special selection process. So again, to revisit this athlete-centric continuum, right, these 3 C's, competence. Put that guy in a position where he's actually able to train. Begin at the beginning. Confidence, bring the bottom up. Not just for the individual, but for the entire group, because eventually you would love to see that entire, right, group average start to increase as well. And then finally, competitiveness. But even when we start getting competitive, all right, it's not win at all costs, not in the weight room. It's keep the goal the goal. Anytime you reach those goals, training doesn't end, right? When you get to that end, all that is really a new beginning for something else. So something we've started doing even a little bit is as one coach's program kind of comes to the end and that new one starts, we'll take guys' numbers from that previous one as opposed to starting over with new ones. So if a guy comes in fresh, he might get some fresh perspective. If a guy's been there, instead of starting him all the way over, we use that finish point as his new starting point. And finally, me. I couldn't help myself putting this in. Hunter Schur, who's one of the coaches, who might or might not have golden locks, recently finished up a program. That program was called Sprinkles Are for Winners, right? Naming programs. It's ridiculous. This happened well before I got there, but basically strength coaches started naming the programs as a joke, and what happened, guys loved it because it breathed some personality into it. It made it sort of our own, but at the same time their own. They don't care if we have squats, if we have cleans, if we have sprints. They don't care what we are doing. If we're running naked through the quad in the gymnasium, what's the name of the next program? I guarantee you there's a text on my phone right now, hey, you're coming back next week, right? What's the name of the next program? That's all they care about. But again, just putting a little bit of our personality, a little bit of our expertise, and at the same time avoiding our own agenda. Operator-centric. Put the athlete, put the operator first. The men, the mission, and then me. Much appreciate everybody taking the time on an afternoon. I know it's kind of happy hour. That said, if anybody has questions, I'm happy to answer them now. I'm happy to answer them later. Also, if you want ins and outs of specifically where we're looking to change so that we better adapt our program for some of these demands that I discussed. I know I didn't give specific X's and O's, but that's sort of what the follow-up time is for, or email, phone call, etc. Thank you.